you can certainly hear me. Today we have our guest, Professor Adrian Bowyer from the University of Bath, UK. He's come all the way over here to tell us about his very interesting work on RepRap. To give you a little bit of background, Professor Bowyer is the co-inventor of the Bowyer-Watson algorithm for Voronoi diagrams. That's like you have the dots on the plane and you draw the lines between them, that sort of thing. And his ambition is to retire not knowing what he wants to do when he grows up, because he's gone from mechanical engineering to computer science to this to that. Now he's in mechanical engineering as a senior lecturer, which is equivalent to an associate professor in the U.S. And this looks like a really interesting talk, so I'm glad you could all make it. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you, and while I'm using the word thank you, I'd also like to thank the organisers for inviting me. It's very kind of them. I'd particularly like to thank the sponsors for paying to put me in an aluminium tube in the country that used to be the biggest bully on the block and throw me right across the Atlantic. That was very kind of them. It was particularly kind of them because I've come to talk to you about a project which might have the side effect of bankrupting some of them. We'll just have to make sure that I get my check before that happens. Now, I'm a mechanical engineer and a computer scientist. I've done other things, but those are my two main areas of work. You're all computer scientists. Maybe there are a few electrical engineers here. And I've come to talk about a project which is at the interface between mechanical engineering, computer science, and electronics. So naturally, I've come armed with some slides about biology. Now, run with me on this. It will, I hope, make sense in a bit. You'll see that I'm at a centre, spelled right, centre for Centre for Biomimetic and Natural Technology. Now, I should imagine that most of you have heard of biomimetics, but let's just have a little show of hands. Everybody who knows the word? Ooh, not so many. Okay. Bio, life, mimetic, copying life. I have a colleague who calls this stealing ideas from nature. And that's just about what we're doing. We're taking things in natural systems, organisms, and putting them into engineering. Now, if you're going to go about stealing, you might as well make it a big heist. Here, in this talk, we're going for the real Fort Knox. We're going to be stealing the absolute fundamentals of biology itself. So let's start with them. Here are the two most important phenomena in biology, without any question or shadow of doubt. On the left, we've got self-replication. That is, in fact, the single most important phenomenon in biology. Indeed, it's possible to produce a trenchant and cogent argument that that is the most single important phenomenon in the entire universe. But, in particular, the fact that we have a universe that supports self-replication. But just moving back down to ground for a moment, we can see a cow here that's managed to replicate herself. We can see some cells at the top there that are dividing and replicating themselves. The most replication in those two pictures is actually going on in the background amongst all that purple stuff. There's a great deal of replication going on there. Self-replication is the thing that defines biology. Indeed, the best definition of biology is it's the study of things that copy themselves. That's what it's about. Now, self-assembly is almost as important. Not quite, but almost. And that happens at a whole variety of scales. At the top there, we've got a picture of a hemoglobin molecule, a protein. Proteins are made by putting amino acids together. That isn't self-assembly. That's done under the control of transfer RNA and a thing called a ribosome. But once that's happened, the molecule, which starts off as a long chain, folds itself into a beautiful three-dimensional machine entirely on its own. Well, most of them do. One or two don't, but most of them do. On a much larger scale, if you look at a termite's nest with the termites inside it, considered as a system as a whole, is a self-assembling system. The termites follow blind rules, and the result of their following those blind rules, which incidentally are quite simple, is a termite's nest, which is a pretty impressive structure. Just to give you some idea how impressive, the ratio between a termite and a termite's nest is about the same as the ratio between a human being and Los Angeles. Now, the difference, of course, is that Los Angeles is a largely two-dimensional structure, whereas the termites managed to do it in three. There's another self-assembling thing there. That's the little man standing in front. We all assemble ourselves. There were no machines outside us as we were growing up, putting us together and deciding how our arms went and how our legs went. So we've got those two really important phenomena. But not all replicators, not all self-copiers, exhibit them both. The very simplest replicators get more complicated replicators to do the assembly bit. On the left, we've got a rhinovirus, that's coughs and colds. And on the right, we've got a mammal. And she is in the process of having her self-assembling system subverted by these rhinoviruses. She's producing billions of these things to order, and she really doesn't like it. That is a parasitic relationship, of course, and the virus manages to get itself replicated by having the instructions for replicating itself within itself, but hijacking the assembly systems in higher organisms. So we don't actually need both of these two really important things at the very simplest level. Here's another very important biological phenomenon. Not quite as important as the first two, but nonetheless pretty important, and that is symbiosis. Now, the most famous symbiosis, and the one with which I'm sure you've all been familiar since school, is that between the insects and the flowering plants. This evolved about 140 million years ago in the late Jurassic, and it's been going from strength to strength ever since. When you go to a dinner party and somebody has made a tasteful and pleasant arrangement in the middle of the table of a series of amputated sexual organs, the fact that it looks so beautiful is that those amputated sexual organs have been driven by the selection of insects. Now, what is actually going on here is that there's an exchange, of course. The plants produce nectar, which the insects want, and the plants also want the insects to transfer pollen, so the insects get paid when they visit the plant in nectar, and they take the pollen to the next plant. So both species benefit. That's a symbiosis. It's unlike the parasitic relationship we saw before, because here both actually do rather well. There's another sort of symbiosis, which is a little bit closer to home, and which is arguably just about as effective as this one. The species that forms that brown field at the top there has enslaved another species. It's persuaded that second species to clear vast tracts of land of all possible competition, to kill all predators, to kill all invasive species, to make sure that when it produces its offspring, some proportion of those are kept in a dry place until the next year. The second enslaved species, which you can see under that little awning there, that second enslaved species works night and day for the benefit of the field of corn. Similarly, chickens can't fly, they can't run, and they taste quite good. You'd think that would be a recipe for evolutionary disaster. In fact, chickens are the most successful bird in all of evolutionary history. There are 15 billion of them on the planet. That's more than any other bird species, not just now, but ever. Why are chickens so successful? Only one reason, because they have a symbiosis with the most powerful organism that has ever lived. Now, that symbiosis is very, very close to the first one. Here, eggs and flour make cookies, and as a consequence, we are getting paid to assist these other species with reproduction. We take the place of the insects, the other species are taking the place of the flowers. The analogy is very, very close indeed. Let's have a little look at what people have done about artificial self-replicators and assemblers. Now, I've got a picture of John von Neumann here, but in fact this idea goes right back to the 19th century. The first person to talk about a machine that could copy itself was actually Samuel Butler in his novel Erewhon, which was only published a few years after Darwin's Origin of Species, very much based on the ideas in it. But von Neumann was the first person to look at the whole question mathematically. He conceived of a theoretical device which he called a universal constructor, and here the word universal takes the same meaning just about as it does when we all talk about a universal Turing machine. By universal constructor he means a constructing device which is capable of working with all its own materials. And so a universal constructor would be a computer, typically linked to a manufacturing robot, and the combination would be able to copy themselves. Now, in von Neumann's day, of course, it wasn't possible to make such a machine, though one could see that theoretically it might be possible. And in fact, von Neumann was interested in things like how few was the minimum possible number of steps that were necessary for such a machine to replicate itself. People subsequently have actually made real machines and also done lots of simulations on computers. Here's a recent one by Hod Lipson and his team, which was in, you may have seen it, it was in Nature a year ago. What's going on here is that we have a fundamental building block, which is made outside the system, which consists of a cube, top left there, split along its diagonal, and each of the faces of the cube has a series of electromagnets which can be energized or not. And if you actually go straight down from that top left picture to the sequence labeled, in black, 0, 0, 0 there, the little tower of cubes there, that tower is capable of moving itself around, and if you supply it with some extra cubes, the red circle as you move a little bit further along, it will build a copy of itself. So we started with a single tower top left, double tower bottom right, double tower actually both slightly taller. And so we've got something here which in principle at least is copying itself. It seems like a bit of a cheat to most people though, because we've put this enormously complicated object in at the top left, and that surely is rather not playing the game. Well, maybe, maybe not. Think of this. None of you can replicate yourselves without a supply of polysaccharides, proteins, and lipids, each one molecule of which is far more complicated than that little cube up the top left there. So not only is this, if this is cheating, so are you when you have children. Okay. Let's have a look at how we can reduce the complexity of this whole problem a bit, and perhaps try to avoid the need for those cubes. Suppose we made a machine that replicated but didn't self-assemble, like the virus didn't. And suppose also, to give it a bit of a head start, that it exists symbiotically with people and is going to give them goods in return for being helped to replicate, just as the plants gave nectar to the insects when the insects were helping them to replicate. And this brings us on to the main subject of my talk, the Replicating Rapid Prototyper project. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by describing how this machine will work. The project, I should emphasize, is only about halfway through at the moment. Then I'll go on to speculate a little bit about what might happen if the whole thing is a success and takes off. And then finally, I shall have a look and see what implications this might have for the nature of engineering work in general. Now, this morning, Max said that you shouldn't go into hardware. And he said that's no way to make money, because if you go into hardware, you're going to have production problems, and those will soak up all your effort and your time. And conventionally, I'm sure he's absolutely right. He's certainly rich enough to be right most of the time. Now, this is how to bypass that. This allows any of you who wants to, once it's successful, if it's successful, and it may not be, to get into hardware without ever having to do any manufacturing. You can do hardware with this project, which we shall see later on, without ever having to make anything. So let's have a little look, first of all, at how it's going to work. Let's start with rapid prototyping. Now, this I suspect, or 3D printing is another word for this, and it's something which I'm sure most of you have come across. Indeed, let's have another show of hands. Everybody who's sort of heard of this? Almost everybody. Okay. The idea is to make a machine that you plug into a computer and that's capable of producing a three-dimensional object, as opposed to a computer printer, which only prints a two-dimensional object. Though that two-dimensional object can, for example, be an electronic circuit if you put the right goo in your inkjet printer heads. The first appearance of this idea in its modern form was actually due to a guy called David Jones, who used to write a column called under the pen name of Daedalus in the New Scientist. And this goes way back to 1974, when even I was young. Jones is shown there, actually nothing to do with this. He's shown with the piece of the wallpaper that killed Napoleon, which is another of his claims to fame. He was an amazing guy, or he is, I should say, he's still alive. He's an amazing guy. He actually came up with the structure of the fullerenes before Harry Kroto discovered them and got the Nobel Prize for it, for example. That's these spherical carbon molecules. Anyway, back in 1974, he published an article that suggested that one could take a vat of a liquid monomer, that's the precursor to a plastic, before all the molecules have been joined together, and cause those molecules to combine with each other to make a polymer, namely a plastic, under the influence of a laser beam. And if you steered the laser beam around in the liquid, you could build up a three-dimensional object. And subsequently, in 1977, Wynne Kelly Swainston published a patent for exactly the same process. Now, to be fair to Swainston, he actually thought of the idea and filed the patent in 71. So he was beat Jones to the filing, but it didn't become apparent that he'd done it until a few years later. Anyway, that machine, or a slight variation of it, can be made to work. It made a couple of objects down the bottom there, for example. And there are now many different technologies that are capable of printing out a three-dimensional plastic object from a computer all in one shot. And the one that we're going to be interested in from this project, from the point of view of this project, is not this laser-based one, because it's going to be quite difficult to have a machine make a laser for itself. This is sort of the dumbest of these technologies, but it is rather a good one. It's good because it's simple. And how this works is that, I should say it's called fused deposition modelling, for reasons that will become apparent in a moment. You have a drum of a plastic cord, and the cord is the red bit there coming out of the circular drum, and that's fed into a right head which can move horizontally in X and Y, and in that right head the cord is melted, and it's forced out through a very small nozzle, and as the head moves around you can scribble in plastic on the flat plane base which is just underneath there. And when you scribble one layer, you move the base down a little bit, and you scribble the next layer, you scribble the next layer, and so on. And you can build up a three-dimensional object. And the object on the right there, which as you can see is a jigsaw made entirely of plastic. It's not a working jigsaw, that's just a model to see what the manufactured object might look like in the end. That is the sort of thing that you can get out of it. Now, you'll immediately see that there's a slight problem here, and I've glossed over that problem, which is that how do you get things that have an overhang? Well, the answer is you have two materials. You have one material for the actual plastic of the object you're making, and you have another separate material, ideally one that dissolves in water, which you also extrude at the same time, underneath everything that's going to need an overhang. And then you can build up three-dimensional objects of completely arbitrary shape, any shape you like, as complicated as you like. Indeed, the more complicated, the better. The more complicated a shape is with this technology, the easier it is to make. Now, that is a very interesting thing. Why is it so? Because complexity implies lots of holes and gaps. And the more holes and gaps you've got, the less plastic you've got to lay down, and the quicker it works. And it doesn't care how complicated the geometry is. Very, very powerful. Indeed, if you talk to any of your friends who are mechanical engineers and they've ever used one of these machines, they never want to go back to using anything else ever again. It's just magic. You can make anything you want. Okay, well, if this thing's going to be able to copy itself, then we need to be able to have the machine make a right head for itself, which is made in the machine. Now, here we come to a bit of a decision. Are we going to insist that the machine makes absolutely every last final part of the copy machine? And we could try and do that, and it would be a heroic effort to do so, but frankly, I don't care. I want to make one that works, and the compromise I'm prepared to make it work is to say, I'm quite prepared to go down to a hardware store and buy some nuts and bolts. I'm quite prepared to take, well, maybe not. I'm quite prepared to take a strip board and solder together a microcontroller. Actually, we'll see in a minute that that might not be necessary. So I'm quite prepared to spend $5 on a little electric motor. We'll see in a minute that some of these things may not be needed, and we'll also see how the need for them will reduce as time goes on. But the rule is going to be anything that you can't buy in a shop really easily, almost anywhere in the world, is not allowed in. How does this thing work? Well, we have this sketch on the right here was done by a guy called Vic Oliver, who first thought of how to put this machine together. And what we have is a thread of plastic running down from the left-hand side there, and we've just got a turning screw thread which bites into the plastic. As the turning screw thread goes round and round, it forces the plastic downwards, and the plastic comes down into this barrel here, and at the bottom here is actually an old brass bolt, priced 25 cents, which has had a hole drilled down the middle of it, and that's heated, that's where the plastic melts, and is extruded out from a very small hole at the bottom here. So the extra bits and pieces we've got to add to this to make it work are very, very cheap, and we'll see how cheap in a minute. We also need some sort of rapid prototype Cartesian robot, and this is the current one that we're working on. Basically, everything you can see in that picture that's white was made in a rapid prototyping machine, which is basically all of it, except for those metal rods. You can see those are ground metal rods, which again are very cheap and available almost everywhere. and some nuts and bolts and so on, and there are a few electric motors. You'll also see some digital scales on there on the axes. Those are not part of the machine. They're just there for calibration purposes while we're designing it and setting it up. And the right head I just showed you sits in the middle of the machine there, and that flat white expanse in the middle is that writing tray which moves down gradually as the object is being built up. Now, I said that we were prepared to solder together a piece of strip board to make the electronics, but we'd quite like to get rid of that at least. So how are we going to do that? Well, there was a guy who was roughly contemporaneous with von Neumann, actually, John Sargrove, who used to make radios. And this was in the days before printed circuits, and the way Sargrove made radios was this. He took a lump of Bakelite, which had been moulded, with a series of very intricate cavities in it. He then filled those cavities with molten zinc and let it cool and solidify, with the result that all of those cavities together formed the complete circuitry for the radio, all the resistors, inductors and capacitors, not the vacuum tubes. This was back in vacuum tube days. As it came off the production line, all that had to happen was 2 vacuum tubes were plugged in, a loudspeaker was attached, and you had a complete radio. Very cheap for the time. He founded a company, and it was going from strength to strength, and then a good thing happened which did for his company, and that was this. He had a vast order from India, and India was granted independence. That was the good thing. The bad thing was they cancelled the order, and his company went bankrupt, and that was the end of the process. But it was a beautiful process because it worked in 3 dimensions, unlike a printed circuit board, which is 2-dimensional. Anyway, we revived this. On the left, we've got a little robot. It's nothing special as a robot. It's the sort of thing you might expect a 15-year-old to make for a science fair. Just trundles around a bit, and when it bumps into something, it backs away and goes somewhere else. That's not the interesting thing about it. The interesting thing about it is how it was made. Everything in that robot, except the batteries and the chip, top left there, is made in the rapid prototyping machine, and we filled up cavities in the rapid prototype plastic with a metal. We can't use zinc, that melts at 420 degrees C. The metal we use is stuff called Wood's metal, and that melts at 70 degrees C. In other words, it'll melt if you put it in boiling water, and particularly importantly, it'll melt at a lower temperature than the plastic melts. So you can make the plastic object, and you can build an electric circuit, largely 2-dimensional in this case, in the plastic, very easily, just by dribbling the molten metal into the channels you've left. So this gives us a substitute for the strip board that we saw on the previous slide. And also, of course, potentially, this is a fully 3-dimensional process, like Sargrove's original. You can put another layer of plastic on top of that and start building vertical columns of metal, horizontal sheets of circuitry. You can go anywhere you like. You can embed circuitry in otherwise purely mechanical components. Right, you're all computer scientists. Let's look at software and communication a minute then. On the software side, we're writing the code that sits in the PC to control the machine in the religion Java, and we'll try not to be apostates, but we are going to stick with it for the moment. And we have a bunch of microcontrollers, and I'm going to tell you how those are put together. We've got a diagram of the way the communications works in the machine on the right there. We have the host controller, which is a PC running Linux normally, or Windows if you want, because Java, of course, is platform independent. And we connect that to a communications controller, which is little more than the thing that shifts voltage levels, really. And then we then have all the parts of the machine in a token ring. A token ring is not a particularly efficient way of transmitting data, but we don't need a great deal of bandwidth, it turns out. And we can afford to go right down to the individual components, like we don't have a single controller for all 3 axes, we have one controller for each direction of the axis. Now, the real beauty of this scheme is that, you'll notice on the right there, we've got the extruder controller. We can just make new extruders as much as we like, and as many as we like, and just slot them into the ring. And every new extruder deals with a new material. We've got a new material that the machine can build with. Those microcontrollers are being programmed in C, and we're not talking about anything fancy for the microcontrollers. We're using PIC 16F628s, $2 each. I don't know, you can probably tell me what they cost better than I can tell you. From the point of view of the user, we go back to the left-hand screen. Basically, what the user sees is an idealized version of that build bed, which is the green rectangle there, and you just load up a design from your CAD system and put it on the bed, position it where you want the machine to build it, and hit the go button, and away it goes and makes it for you. Well, the obvious question is, does it work? And we haven't finished building the complete machine yet, but we do have a testbed machine, which is built in New Zealand by the guy Vic Oliver, whom I mentioned before. And you can see it looks as if it was built in a garage, really. There are two reasons for that. One is because it was built in a garage, really. And the second reason is that's what we want it to look like. If people can't build these things in their garages, they're not going to spread as fast as if people can build these things in their garages. Now, what he's got there is some rapid prototype parts that actually I made him about as far away from him geographically as it's possible to be. He's in New Zealand, I'm in Great Britain. I made those parts for him, just put them in a jiffy bag and airmailed them to him, put them together. He designed them. He just sent me the designs over the web. And he's also got some plumbing pieces from his local plumbing store there, those copper pipes. And this machine, which we're trying out the software with and trying out various driver strategies and so on, passed a little milestone a month ago. In fact, I can tell you precisely when it was. It was at 10 o'clock in the evening, Central European summertime in Vienna, which is where he was at an exhibition displaying this stuff. The machine made its first component for itself. And it's that rather anonymous little component there, that plastic bracket that you can see ringed in red. Nothing particularly spectacular in the way of a component. But in principle, if we can do that, we can make everything else in the machine. Everything else that's part of its describing geometry. We can't make the chips. That's one of the things we're going to have to add in. Initially, at least. Okay. Well, many of you will have been involved in research projects funded by all sorts of different funding bodies, where the funds were raised by your professors. And those professors had to say that when they got the funds for this project, that this project is going to change the world, because otherwise they wouldn't have got the money. Do they change? No, of course they don't change the world. If you take 1,000 academic research projects from universities anywhere on Earth, how many of those thousands are going to change the world? Answer, none. 10,000, maybe one. Now, I want to emphasize here, from a statistical point of view, there's no reason to suppose this project will be any different. We may finish it, we may get it working, and it may just die away. But let's just indulge in a little bit of fantasy for the moment, and let's ask ourselves the question, what will happen if this idea takes off? Well, let's start by giving it a chance, and the chance we're going to give it is by making it open source. Now, I had planned to explain open source, but I don't need to explain open source to this audience. I'm pretty sure you understand exactly what's going on there. There are little GNU logo over there. Firefox, Apache, Linux, you all know about. IBM and Sun use open source. Indeed, as was pointed out yesterday, everybody uses open source on the planet who's ever used a piece of electronics, ultimately. So we're going... Now, what does it mean by making a piece of hardware open source, though? Well, of course, it means making all the designs open source. In order for this machine to make a copy of itself, all it needs is the design files. Those are the things we load up and say, go, make those. So that is what's going to be open source, together with all the documentation, the code for going to the microcontrollers, the driving code for the PC, everything else. And my motives for making it open source were threefold. One was that thing I mentioned, namely that I wanted to give the project a good head start. The second reason was a moral one. It seemed to me that potentially this is an extremely powerful technology. And the one thing you don't want with an extremely powerful technology is for one group of human beings to have control over it, and for the rest of human beings not to have control over it. And the only way to stop that happening, in particular, I didn't want me to have control over it. And the one way to stop that happening is to give it to everybody. We'll come to the third reason in a little minute. What sort of characteristics might this have? Well, let's suppose that you wanted to make something which many of you have a use for, but I certainly don't, namely a comb. How do you go about doing that conventionally? The answer is you go out and spend $100,000, $200,000 on a thing called an injection molding machine, which has a little cavity and metal inside it the shape of a comb, and squirts nylon into that cavity, and the solidifies, drops out, makes a comb. In fact, you make them about 50 at a time. And such a machine typically could produce 10,000 combs. That's a lot of combs an hour, 10,000. Now, let's be a little bit more modest here. Say the RepRap machine takes a day to copy itself. But in those 24 hours, it's got just enough spare time to make one little pathetic comb. How long before the RepRap machines overtake the injection moulding machine? Well, you all know the power of an exponential increase, so I know you won't be surprised when I tell you it takes 18 days. In a month, there's a RepRap machine for every man, woman, and child on the planet. Now, that won't happen. Why doesn't it happen? Same reason it doesn't happen in biology. Things with exponential growth, because they self-replicate, are also limited by resources. So we're going to have a little bit look at resources later on. Anything that copies itself becomes subject to Darwin's Law of Evolution. You can't avoid it. We are subject to it. Anything we make that copies itself is also subject to it. All living organisms are subject to it. And the analogy here is that the CAD designs are the genotype. That's to say the equivalent of your DNA. And they have to be available, obviously, for the machine to copy itself. The machine itself is the phenotype. That's to say it's the thing that the genes build. In your case, it's with the fact that you've got two arms and the fact that you've got brown eyes, whatever it might be. That's your phenotype. The shape of the machine and its working functions are the phenotype here. And we'll come back to the idea of phenotype in a little while. Now, pretty clearly, if we put this out on the web and make it open source, people are going to improve the design. The first design, I'll be perfectly honest with you, it's lousy. I'm doing it. It's got to be lousy. But many people know much better than I how to design these things. They can download the first one, and if they can get kicked off and started, they can improve that download. Some of those improvements will be posted back on the web. Now, here's a really important point. Suppose you've got one of these machines, and it was one of the ones that was in the first 2 generations maybe, and 5 years have gone by, and there's a really a one that's on the web now that's a lot better. Your old machine can make a machine to the new design. You can upgrade really easily. And what we're going to get, of course, is not natural selection, which works by random mutation. We're going to get artificial selection. Artificial selection is the reason why the wolves that you see people leading down the street have such a grotesque appearance. We made dogs out of wolves by artificial selection by choosing these strange characteristics that we wanted. Artificial selection is what's going to go on here. People are going to choose the characteristics of the machine that they want to emphasize. And they'll probably drive them in several different directions. They want to make them faster, they want to make them simpler, they want to make them more accurate. And in particular, going back to my nuts and bolts and circuits and so on, they'll probably want to make them with fewer added parts. There's no reason in principle why we shouldn't print electronics as opposed to just printing electric circuitry if we can get the right semiconductor polymers in there. And what you're going to get is this form of speciation. That's to say the division of one thing into several different species. I put it in quotes because the idea of a species only makes biological sense for something that reproduces sexually. Clearly this machine doesn't. And you get runaway symbiotic selection. Runaway symbiotic selection was what made the vase of amputated sexual organs in the middle of the dinner table look so beautiful. The reason it looks beautiful to you is because it also looks beautiful to insects. We're not going for beauty here, we're going for functionality. I know nothing about economics, so any of you can correct me here. I don't even know my own salary. It's not something that very much interests me, but it seems to me that these facts are true. If they weren't, they wouldn't be facts, of course. It doesn't matter how much the first machine costs, and incidentally it's not costing very much. I should say that the research grant under which I'm developing this is the smallest research grant, I'm proud to say, that I've ever had in my entire career as a university academic. And I want to keep it that way. I'd like to develop this with a minimum amount of resources. But the first one is still going to be relatively expensive because it took that research grant to make it. But the next one only costs the raw materials plus whatever the labour of the assembly time is. And that's a big reduction. Once you've got one, you can have any number of the things, obviously. So as soon as you acquire one, you can have a warehouse full of 100. Interestingly, no one can make money by selling this machine. It has the potential to make wealth beyond the dreams of even the most avaricious capitalist, but it can't be made to yield money by selling it. Think about why. Suppose you have a machine that copies itself and you sell it to me for $1,000. Immediately, I can make it copy itself and sell the copy for $900, $800, $700, $600. all the way down to that raw materials plus assembly time cost. Now, that means a number of interesting things happen economically. I should say, incidentally, that our target cost for all those raw materials, motors, chips, and so on is about $400. We wanted to pitch it at about the same level as a dishwasher, something like that. So that's the reason we've gone for that. Incidentally, the commercial machines that do this, the one we're using to make all the parts for the very first machine, they cost more than 20 times that much. Another question is the question of material supply. We've got to put plastic in this machine for it to make useful stuff for us, and other materials as well, perhaps, but plastic will be the main one. At the moment, the plastic we're using is a stuff called polycaprolactone, which is a plastic like nylon. It's really tough and strong, very useful for making mechanical parts, but it has the added advantage that it melts, again, at about 60 or 70 degrees C. That makes it really easy to manipulate. But we want to move on, when we've got that working, to the plastic polylactic acid. And that is nice because it can be made by fermentation from starch. In other words, you grow corn, you can make your own supply of plastic, and that process of making the plastic is essentially a fermentation process. And of course, you have the RepRap machine make the fermenter for you. So not only is the machine self-copying, now your supply of the main material is self-copying too. Think about that. Immediately it becomes apparent that the one thing in that equation about costs that's most significant is that time to put the thing together. And what that means is that you're at a real advantage if your time is cheap. This is bringing manufacturing to the poorest people in the world. At the moment, if you're a poor person, you can't get a foot on the manufacturing ladder because it takes $100 million to set up a factory. This allows you to set up a factory in a sub-Saharan village for a few $100s. There are other people working on similar ways of doing this, not with self-replication, but I'm sure many of you have heard of projects which, things like the Fab Lab, for example. Everyone heard of that? Ooh, a few, yeah, okay. Anyway, the idea is to parcel up a whole fabrication facility in basically a ship container and move it anywhere in the world and dump it and allow people to make stuff for themselves. This slightly short-circuits all that. And what it does is to make manufacturing like the oldest technology we ever had. The oldest technology we ever had dealt with self-replicating entities. It's agriculture, of course. And the economics of it become very much like agriculture. As I'm sure you all know, if it wasn't for Europe having very restrictive laws about what can be imported in the way of food, and similarly for the US having very restrictive laws about what can be imported in the way of food, all our food, both in Europe and in the US, would be grown by the world's poorest people. The only reason, and they would thereby get less poor, of course. The only reason it's not is because we want to protect that tiny proportion of our own populations who are farmers, and as a consequence, they can't get a foothold. But here, they can get a foothold. They can make stuff and start exporting it, doing what they like with it, as everybody does with manufactured goods, and they have the advantage of these low labor costs. Finally, there's this whole question of recycling. If everybody can make stuff, they're going to make junk. And they're going to make things which are not reliable. What's the point of making something reliable if you can just get your RepRap machine to make another one overnight? It'll break. So recycling becomes a serious issue. And I thought that this was going to be a big business opportunity. There were going to be trucks driving up and down the freeway full of broken RepRap bits going to the recycling. But then I realized, of course, that you can make the machine do its own recycling in part. In fact, for the materials that I've just described, recycling is a really easy thing to do. What you do is you boil your RepRap robot or your RepRap iPod or whatever it might be, and the woods metal drops out of it into the bottom of the saucepan. If you're clever, you put a little grid in the bottom of the saucepan and the chips will drop out because they were held in by the woods metal and they land on the grid. Put them right back through into the next product. And the polylactic acid, the plastic, gets a bit soft, but nothing much happens to that. That you throw on your compost heap for your corn. Polylactic acid is fully biodegradable. 6 months, it'll be turned back into the soil. So the whole process can go round and round and round. I want to look at a couple of potential products that this machine might make. There are loads of these that people have put on the website, the wiki of the website. But these two, it seems to me, have the potential to do interesting things to the world. And they're both things you'll recognize. There's a telephone there, and those are some pills on the right. Let's start with the telephone. Now, there are already projects to make an open phone. Many of you will have heard of the Tux phone. Tux, of course, the Linux Penguin. The idea here is to make a design for a cellular phone which anybody can manufacture for themselves. But this is going to be a conventional cellular phone which needs a base station operated by a phone company in order to talk to other people. But it will be a free open design on the web. Now, you can go one better than that, of course. You could make a phone that used Wi-Fi and connected to a local wireless hotspot wherever it found one and allowed you to make free voice over internet calls over the web. That's one better than having to pay the phone company. But suppose you go one further step still and you make each phone a base station for all the surrounding phones in its local area. So the phones now not just initiate and receive calls, they also act as a relay for the calls of the other phones in, for example, this room. So your phone would be sending a signal to his phone, would be sending a signal to his phone, and then off out, and so on. You don't need any base stations for that, as long as you've got a chain of phones between where you want to start and where you want to end. There might be gaps, and you might have to dive into the internet to fill those gaps, but in principle, and in particular as this idea becomes more widespread, you can have a communication system without base stations. And we now come to a bit of game theory, and we're going to revisit game theory again in a minute. You've got to make the thing stable. How do you make it stable? Well, each of these phones that I'm proposing needs to be able to attenuate its signal with the proximity to whatever it's talking to. Now, that's done by cell phones at the moment. As you know, with a cell phone, when you're near to the base station, it doesn't transmit nearly as powerfully as it does when you're farther away, so that's easy technology. It must relay signals from its neighbours, as I've indicated there, but there's a third condition which is absolutely vital, and that's this. Whenever anyone introduces a new phone into this room, say, then all the phones around it check that new connection, and they only consent to relay signals from it if conditions 1 and 2 are satisfied. In other words, if you try and come in and act selfishly in this network, then your signals don't get transmitted. And that's what's called an evolutionarily stable strategy, and we'll look at that again in a moment. And if you have phones of those three characteristics, they can expand without limit. And in particular, of course, the more of them that you have in an area, the higher and higher the bandwidth gets. The whole question about charges for net access and high speed and low speed was raised in the last talk. This is one way around that. The more active components you get in a system like this, the higher the bandwidth, and nobody's paying for any of that bandwidth at all. Right, let's look at open pharma. Pharmacological industry makes $1 or $2. Let's see if we can subvert that. A year's supply of a new drug like Herceptin, say, which is for breast cancer, costs about $40,000, and that's going up all the time. If you've got a microfluidic desktop synthesizer that can make the drug, that costs currently about $200,000, but that cost is falling. And of course, if we could have the RepRap machine make the synthesizer, that cost would fall radically. Now, there's a very interesting aspect to UK patent law, and you can tell me whether it's the same in this country, but under UK law, any private individual can make something that's patented for their own use without paying a royalty. You're not allowed to sell it, you're not allowed to make money with it, but you can make it for your own use. When I told my doctor this, he was amazed. He said, yes, this is the answer. Because, of course, in the UK, we have taxation-funded healthcare, and the government spends scores of billions of pounds a year on drug patenting and drug patents. If they could give each patient a synthesizer so that every morning 50 millilitres come out in a little vial which they can pour into their orange juice, then they don't need to pay the drug companies anything, and it's all completely legal under the patent licensing arrangement, because the patient is not selling it, they're not moving it on to anybody else. Now, ask yourself this question. You are the British government. You have the opportunity to save scores of billions of pounds a year, or you have the opportunity to change the law as the drug companies are screaming at you to do. What do? You save the money. They're not going to change this law when this idea gains hold. Now think about what happens over here when this happens in countries like the UK, when and other countries where healthcare is funded out of taxation. All your insurance companies are going to say, look, in Great Britain, they're saving all this money. We're paying out, as insurance companies, vast amounts to these drugs. Introduce laws like the UK law, please. And you've got the stage set for a real battle between the insurance companies and the pharmacological companies in this country. Back in the UK, we're just going to get better. But you guys, well, we'll watch with interest. Anyway, the other thing it allows is something even more radical. These machines are inherently versatile. You can change the synthesis pathway and make a different molecule. And before you know anything, people will be going onto the net saying, look, I downloaded this molecule, I got my machine making it, but I found it gave me headaches. Sure, it put my cancer into remission, but I didn't like the headaches. Now, all right, headaches are a price to pay for putting your cancer into remission, that's good. But, this person says, I changed this OH group for a methyl group, my cancer's still in remission, but I don't get the headaches anymore. Suddenly, the entire human race becomes its own guinea pig. What are the implications of all this for engineering, which is what you guys do in general? You're software engineers. Engineering software is essentially the same discipline as engineering an automobile. You're dealing with different materials, but the mental activities involved are very, very similar. Well, here are a few cliches. It's always a good idea to have cliches in a talk because you can be pretty sure that cliches are at least true. In the 19th century, of course, was the century of steam power. 20th century was the century of electric data. It was also the century of electric power, but the real key thing about the 20th century was electric manipulation of information. Started with radio, ended with the internet, of course, and indeed the cellular phone. You'll have heard it said countless times that the 21st century will be the century of biology. What does that mean? Well, I contend it means the century of Darwinian engineering, and I'm going to be very careful to explain exactly what I mean about this. But before that, we should have this little line that says, history doesn't happen in centuries. Of course it doesn't, but nonetheless it's convenient for the purpose of making a point on the slide. Here's a load of jargon. Let's have a little look at it and see if it means something. It's biologist jargon. Darwinian engineering is the design of self-replicating machines and their extended phenotypes so that they collectively exhibit an evolutionarily stable strategy. Well, I mentioned that briefly before, but we'll look at it more now. Let's look at these terms. Start off with the self-replicating machines. What have we got available? Well, we've got all of nature. Nature is divided into three great branches. There are the bacteria, the archaea, which are both single-celled organisms, and then there are the eukarya, which is everything in nature that you see when you look. You can't see the first two. The eukaryotes, which are oak trees, whales, seaweed, all that stuff. That's a bit of a froth on the top, really. The first two are the really important ones. But the third one is a bit important to us because we're in it. And I put some pictures of these things up. There's a grasshopper over there. There's a field of grass, indeed, there. And there are some people. Why have I included people? Well, two reasons. One is because we're the ones having the ideas here. Grasshoppers are not noted for their ability at rational and creative thought. Whereas these things really are quite good at it. So we're a significant input into the system. The other reason I put us there is because we cannot get out of the system. We are part of the system, and when we're engineering things, we have to acknowledge that we're part of the system and deal with that just like any other part of the system. Finally, of course, coming online, we hope, or I hope at least, we've got these artificial replicators, which in principle, though they're much cruder than all the other ones, in principle are just an extra addition in the mix. The idea of an extended phenotype is a very profound biological idea, very important, but it is rather abstract. It's due to Richard Dawkins. I mentioned phenotypes before. They're things like eye colour, which is decided by your genes. In fact, most phenotypes are decided by the interaction between your genes and the environment in which you develop. So, for example, the length of your leg is part of your phenotype, but that's not entirely decided by your genes. It's decided also by how much calcium your parents gave you when you were a child. It's not just physical characteristics, it can be also mental characteristics. Cheetahs have a phenotype behaviour, which is that whenever they see a Thompson's gazelle, they chase it. And Thompson's gazelle have an equally phenotype behaviour, which is whenever they see a cheetah, they run away. This is very sensible for both of them to do. Sometimes the Thompson's gazelle wins, less often the cheetah wins. Nonetheless, the cheetahs get to live and the Thompson's gazelles get to live. Behavior can be a phenotype as well. The idea of the extended phenotype is that it's back to a physical entity again, or possibly something slightly more subtle, but let's stick with physical entities. The extended phenotype of a bird is its nest. We're back to something like the length of the leg again, but now it's a piece of the external environment which has been affected by the behavior of the animal, and it affects the survival and the reproduction of the animal. If birds didn't build nests, they wouldn't be nearly so good at surviving. And of course, human beings have the most extraordinarily convoluted extended phenotype of all possible species. We build nests that look like that. The whole of human culture is our extended phenotype. Now, this is something which I suspect a lot of you are familiar with, the idea of an evolutionarily stable strategy. Again, can I have a show of hands? Ooh, quite a few of you. Okay. An evolutionarily stable strategy is either a phenotype or a set of phenotypes that can't be invaded by mutation. Now, I'll be very precise about what I mean here in a minute, but let's look at an example to start off with. Forget about the fact that hawks and doves are two completely separate biological species for the moment. Just assume that they were describing behavior characteristics. Hawks always fight. Doves always run away when they get into a fight. And let's look at a utility matrix, in the game theoretic sense, of what the gains and losses are when these two meet. When hawks meet hawks, top left box, then they lose 25. They do badly because they fight. They maybe both get injured. The resources walk away, which they were trying to eat while they're fighting. The least of it, they at least waste some time. So when two hawks meet, they do badly. When a hawk meets a dove, top right, then the hawk does really well. That gets 50 points. The dove doesn't do so well at all, as we shall see in a moment. But a hawk meeting a dove does well. When a dove meets a hawk, the dove runs away. So it doesn't gain anything, but it doesn't lose anything very much either, so that gets 0. And when two doves meet, they maybe coo at each other a bit, but they can share the resource, so they get a little bit of a positive. They get a 15. Now, with those numbers there, and of course you can mess around with the numbers and get a different result, the ratio of hawks to doves in the population comes out at 3 to 2. And that's what's called an evolutionarily stable strategy, in that the phenotype there is the ratio of those hawks to doves. You can't move away from that ratio, except, of course, by changing the numbers in the matrix. If, for some reason, the population does move away from that, it'll evolve back to that stable point again. Should mention, incidentally, that for human beings, for this particular characteristic, which is very simplified characteristic, we, of course, all occasionally behave aggressively, and we all, more commonly, behave nicely to each other. In fact, that ratio is very much different from that. Hawk and hawkish behavior in the human population is actually very, very rare indeed. So the utility matrix must be very much different to that one for us. Now, the point about this is that the phenotype here is that ratio in the population, and you won't move away from that unless you change the utility matrix. That doesn't mean, for example, that a different strategy can't come in. Like, for example, you're an owl that behaves towards a hawk like a hawk and behaves towards a dove like a dove. That changes things a little bit as well. Now, for those of you who know game theory, every evolutionary stable strategy is a Nash equilibrium in the game. Not every Nash equilibrium in the game, though, is an ESS. That's because not every Nash equilibrium is necessarily stable. Let's go back to that Darwinian engineering idea. Now, I haven't highlighted the terms, but at least we've seen what they mean. The design of self-replicating machines and their extended phenotypes, that's what the engineers are doing, messing around with this stuff. We may even mess around with ourselves, or we may simply include ourselves as we are in the equation, so that they collectively exhibit an evolutionarily stable strategy. That's how to do a piece of engineering that will last. When you're looking at biologically inspired engineering, that's the equivalent of saying, build a building so it's on a good, firm, solid base, as opposed to an inverted pyramid which is going to fall over. The RepRap project is an example of this. It's designed around the evolutionary stable strategy of the plants and the insects. The self-replicating machines here are the people and the RepRap machine itself. The phenotypical behavior is people helping the machine to copy, and the RepRap machine making useful stuff for the people, just like the pollen carrying and the nectar production. And, as I say, we've got an ESS, the Symbiosis like the insects and flowers. Now, that's just one example, but you can see that one can do an awful lot of engineering using these principles in order to design a product that's going to last and last and last. What's going to happen in the future? Well, maybe a 10th generation RepRap in every home, who knows? Maybe not, as I said at the beginning. Maybe it'll go nowhere. But of course that means fewer factories. Someone once told me that the world market for coat hooks is unimaginably bigger than the world market for jet engines, which is an interesting fact. This machine can make coat hooks like they're going out of fashion, you know. All the coat hook factories in the world, forget about them. Less goods transport. We don't need trucks moving up and down the roads to move coat hooks from the factory to the store. We don't need to drive to the store to buy a coat hook. We can just download a coat hook from the web and have our machine make it in the attic. And also it means less real need for money. All of these activities that we're talking about here mean exchange of money. And we're not exchanging very much money at all in all of this. Of course, that doesn't mean that we'll get rid of money. On the contrary, what we'll do is we'll make more wealth, and the money will come to represent different things. There's no way that this machine, for example, is going to allow you to buy an airline ticket, except you've got money to pay the airline to get you on the aircraft to get over where you want to go. So money will find different applications, and it won't reduce, but wealth will increase, as it were, without very much money. Okay, let me just finish the quick acknowledgements. The Nuffield Foundation, the EPSRC, which is the Engineering Physical Sciences Research Council, which is roughly the UK equivalent of the NSF, and my own university's Innovative Manufacturing Research Centre have all put various resources into this. The people involved are all over the world. There's myself there and my student Ed Sells in the UK, a couple of guys in New Zealand, Vic Oliver and Simon McAuliffe. There's Zach Smith in the US on the right there. I met him the day before yesterday, in fact, for the first time. I've never met the New Zealand guys. Brett Belmore. There's Michael Hart, who's actually here in the front row, waving his hat. Forrest Higgs and a guy called Simon Balliard in Canada. So it's people all over the world working on this project. Okay, if you're interested, my final slide is there's the URL for the project. Go and have a look, see what you like. Has anybody got any questions? Sir? I suspect not. Bear in mind that it isn't jobs that make wealth, it's wealth that makes jobs. And if you put something into a system that makes more wealth, that actually in the long term means more jobs. Back in the 1950s, which you're far too young to remember, everybody was terribly worried that computers were going to mean that nobody would ever have any jobs again, and we'd all spend our entire lives playing tennis. That's happened, of course, as you know. So, no. Put more wealth into the system, you actually make more work and more jobs. It just means that people get richer. So. Yep. Yep. I suspect the most difficult thing to print in an open source digital camera would be the lens. I can see a way to do the electronics. I can see a way to do the CCD detector. The lens, getting something to print right down to the accuracy of the wavelength of light, which is what you need, is not impossible. There are machines that will do that, but they need real precision. Yes, I don't see it. That's back to that evolution. One of the nice things about this project is that if I can just push the first one out there, I can sit back and let Charles Darwin take over all the rest of the work and make the machine better and better and better. Right. The current specification is that we're working in a volume of 300 millimeter cube, that's a foot cube, and we're working to a resolution of 0.1 of a millimeter. Now, I don't know what that is in Imperial, I can't remember, somebody can tell me. But that's, in fact, the specification of the resolution there is the one that we worked out would allow the machine to be sufficiently accurate to carry on copying itself. I should mention, incidentally, that we're using exactly the same trick to maintain accuracy that conventional machine tools have used for 200 years. If any of you have ever used a lathe or a mill, you'll find that the axes which move around have little screw adjusters on them so that when you make something, you can get the machine back into the accuracy that it had before. This is the same, it's got screw adjusters all over it, so if it makes a minor mistake in the manufacture that doesn't stop the machine working, you can adjust that mistake back out again. Sorry, him and then. Well, well, as short as possible is the answer. The first one is going to be slow. Typically, an object about as big as my fist in one of the commercial machines now takes about 4 or 5 hours. Now, we probably want to match that to start off with, or possibly go a bit slower because we're a lot cheaper. We don't care. And one of the things to remember, though, is this self-replication allows you to get as fast a production system as you want, because you can copy the machine itself and suddenly you've doubled your production rate. No, on the contrary, it's actually speeded things up. The guys in New Zealand and the guys here and Canada, because development goes on 24 hours when we all get up and when we all go to bed and so on, we got a load of emails saying, oh, here's an improved file in the morning, which the other guy did overnight. It works really nicely, I have to say. The whole thing is on SourceForge. So, for example, all the software and indeed all the electronic design and so on is also under Subversion, so we can just download improvements overnight that the other guy's done, you know. Well, we have. The Cartesian robot I showed with the blue background, that's the one we're building. We haven't finished making it work yet. The New Zealand guys just happen to be slightly ahead of us and have got theirs working a few months early, because they used plumbing bits and we used proper engineering bits. Sorry, I did point to someone over there. No, I didn't actually. Your question I already answered. Sir, with a beard. Yeah. I have an existence proof that we can do much better than that. The existence proof is living organisms. Every living organism is unimaginably intricate and complicated compared with the most extraordinary product of conventional engineering. And this entire process is driving the whole of engineering in the direction of biology. So if you keep the thing evolving, and if there's a reason for it to evolve to produce something of whatever precision you like, which is achievable under the laws of physics, then it should be able to go there. As you know, I'm sure, how many of you have seen pictures from a scanning tunneling microscope? Oh, lots of you. As you know, a scanning tunneling microscope can manipulate individual atoms to move them around and place them in different places. You can quite literally pick up a single atom and put it down somewhere else. No reason why you shouldn't do that with something made in this way. Not with a first generation machine, of course, that's nowhere near accurate enough, but keep it going and you can get there. I hope that the first one will be released on the web as a complete open source design. Anybody can have it in 2008. You have asked a question, so I'll go to someone who hasn't. The guy in the white t-shirt there, with the grey shirt on.
What are your safety concerns, if you have? What are your concerns about this going in a direction you might not want to go?
Of course it will. I have no control over it. Every let's take weapons as the obvious example. The first thing to say is, if you've got $400 and you want to make weapons, don't bother with this. Just go onto eBay and buy a second-hand lathe. You can cut a swathe with a lathe. Indeed, you'd be amazed if you talk to any decent mechanical engineer what a lot of nasty things you can make with a perfectly ordinary 200-year-old technology lathe. This is not quite in the same league as that when it comes to making nasty stuff, but people will still figure out how to use it to make nasty stuff. But then, in that way, it's no different from any other manufacturing technology. Lathes are not very expensive, as I've just indicated. They're more restricted than this in one sense, but they're less restricted in the sense that they can deal with much harder materials, which is why that makes them so much more dangerous. But just think about this. If you give the human race an internal combustion engine, sure, a few people will go away and use it to make tanks. many, many more people will go away and use it to make ambulances. It's back to that hawk-dove thing. Most people are actually rather well-intentioned, rather kindly towards everybody else. We get the impression that that's not so because of the way that news works. News doesn't show us what's important. News shows us, the clues in the title, what's new. So news is differentiating the level of importance of things and just showing us the derivative. And that's why we get the impression that everybody is shooting each other all the time, because that's actually quite a rare event. That means that it is news.
How does that show like on a macro scale of things when you're actually starting to build up
Yep.
years down the road?
Yep.
The structural strain of it as composite materials become better and better, like composite materials as well.
Well, one of the nice things about this is it can make composite materials. Of course, it will go. No question it'll evolve in the direction of making things at higher temperatures, stronger materials, more subtle materials, and so on. You're right, it will go that way. And in that way, it's no different from any other manufacturing technology. But we take that hit with everything else we do. Almost every piece of engineering that gets done can be put to bad uses, as I'm sure you're all very much aware. It's hard to think of a piece of engineering that can't be used with sufficient imagination to kill somebody. And that is something that we have to live with as engineers, and we just have to say to ourselves, well, if it does more good than bad, then on balance in the utilitarian world, it is a good thing.
How will modifications of the design occur without special human intervention?
They won't. Well, I'm sorry, they won't except for one very small and probably fairly insignificant point, which I'll come to in a moment. The whole idea is that people are driving the evolution of this in just the same way as we drove the evolution of dwarf wheat or turned aurochs into cows for cattle in our barnyards. And we drove all that evolution by selection. People are doing the selection here. They're downloading the design of this machine they most like. They're improving it in the way they want. They're uploading the improvement. Maybe they'll keep it themselves. But the design will gradually improve by not natural selection, but by artificial selection. Now, it's true that you can't have something that copies itself without errors creeping in. As you know, this is the basis of Darwinian evolution, and errors will creep in here. Very, very occasionally, much more occasionally than improvements will be made by people, one of those errors is going to be a good thing, but that'll be so remote an event that it'll be something for biologists to look at, I suspect, and ponder upon. But it'll be people doing it to answer the question.
What would you say the biggest obstacle you're facing with this project is right now?
I don't want to sound immodest, but I can't see any obstacles. We know how to do everything we want to do up to 2008 when we do our first release. In other words, we've done background studies on all the bits and pieces. We made all the bits work in other experiments in isolation. It's just a question of just dangerous. Is there some wood here for me to touch? Yes, there is. It was a question of having the original idea, proving to ourselves that the most difficult bits, which is essentially the extruder, that was the difficult bit to make and get right. And it's probably not right, but it's good enough. Once we had that, we were reasonably confident that the rest of it could be done. Someone at the back, I keep asking people at the front because I'm short-sighted. Sir, right at the back there.
Do you agree or disagree that engineers need licenses to practice and be held to standards? And what do you think the impact will be when anybody can do their own engineering and then build whatever they design?
It depends what you mean by need. You said, do I think that engineers need licenses? The answer to your question is, incidentally, I don't know. I don't have an opinion on it. But what I do know is this. There are 4 levels at which control and influence in the world works. At the bottom level, you've got things like, basically, things written on pieces of paper by other human beings which tell you what to do, like don't eat pork, or don't copy this thing and give it to somebody else. Now, that's laws, in other words, and rules. That's the bottom. Next level up is economics. Economics almost always trumps rules. Think of MP3. Above economics is biology. Biology always trumps economics. Think of this example. $400 trainer shoes. That's completely irrational economically to buy $400 trainer shoes. Why is anybody doing it when they can buy $50 trainer shoes which are just as good? Answer, the same thing as the answer to why does the peacock have a fancy tail. That's what the trainer shoes are doing for that person. And that's a biological effect, not an economic effect. The thing that trumps biology is the laws of physics. Biology can't do anything against the laws of physics. If it could, for example, there'd be an organism that had evolved which used perpetual motion in order to power itself. It doesn't exist. Why? Because the second law of thermodynamics says it can't. So you've got those four levels. Now, when you talk about licensing engineers, you're talking about working at the bottom level to try and regulate something here which is working between levels 2 and 3. And that's a kind of category error. You aren't going to succeed in controlling this by passing laws at the bottom in order to make something happen up near the top.
Or to make it not happen.
Or to make it not happen.